would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
To Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.TV. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to kind of dive into the news with the latest bill that President Trump has signed. I have an article here from Reason.com. If you haven't heard, he signed a new bill that increases or tightens sanctions on Russia and Iran and North Korea. A lot of news agencies are talking about, tighter sanctions on Russia, and that's about it. No, it's tighter sanctions on Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The bill was H.R. 3364, and it's called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. This article here, Reason.com. Today, President Donald Trump signed H.R. 3364, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which tightens sanctions on Russia, Iran, and North Korea. He also issued a signing statement expressing a number of reservations with the bill, mainly about its limits on the president's power to de-escalate tensions by reducing sanctions unilaterally. Nevertheless, he promises to give careful and respectful consideration to the preferences expressed by the Congress while implementing them in a manner consistent with the president's constitutional authority to conduct foreign relations. While it's important for Congress to assert its constitutional authority in the conduct of foreign relations, H.R. 3364 suggests its priorities are skewed. Additional sanctions will only hurt U.S. relations with the affected countries. Congress should instead be focused on asserting its authority where it has long abrogated issues of war-making and treaties. Yet it has shown little interest in this, even as various members of Congress have expressed their belief that the president presents a unique threat to global stability. And as long as we don't freeze up here. Okay. It says now a new National Defense Authorization Act is working its way through Congress with little concern for reining in a decade-and-a-half-long war on terror that has mostly increased the threat of terrorism by creating new safe havens for terrorists across the Muslim world, rather than reassert its role in a global war spinning out of control, one that, by all indications, President Trump is escalating further. Congress has chosen to install more obstacles to peace. Congressional Democrats, in particular, are sacrificing the progress made by Barack Obama in U.S.-Iranian relations, all to advance their narrative that Russia poses a grave threat to American democracy. In a Wall Street Journal interview, the complete transcript transcript of which Politico released yesterday, Trump said if it were up to him, the U.S. would have already withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal. His administration has certified twice already that Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson acknowledged it in comments yesterday that he and the president disagree on the nuclear deal's usefulness. In the journal interview, Trump indicated he was deferring to the State Department. In March, President Trump suggested he would be honored to meet with Kim Jong-un. In an additional statement accompanying his H.R. 3364 signing statement, the president complains that the bill encroaches on the executive branch's authority to negotiate with other countries. Congress could not even negotiate a health care bill after 7 years of talking, Trump noted. So far, I don't see a reason why you would sign it other than you want to push this. But I'll get to that part. Trump should not hesitate to have one-on-one talks with Kim or with the presidents of Iran or Russia. Such meetings have a lot of potential upside and not much of a downside, as relations with all three countries are pretty poor already. Trump concludes his signing statement with some comments on Ukraine, which celebrated the new sanctions against Russia. His administration, Trump insists, particularly expects the Congress to refrain from using this flawed bill to hinder our important work with the European allies to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and from using it to hinder our efforts to address any unintended consequences it may have for American business, our friends, or our allies. Undermining U.S. foreign relations is easy, particularly when politicians have been whipped up in a xenophobic fever. Improving peaceful foreign relations is difficult, and this bill only makes it more so. It doesn't just impose new sanctions without a strategy for how to improve relations with affected countries, but it limits the options available to salvage these relations, a potentially deadly case of path dependence. So he complains that it hinders, that it actually, quote, encroaches on the executive branch's authority to negotiate with other countries. So if the executive branch has this authority to negotiate with other countries, then it's not Congress's duty. But a Congress that can't declare war, can't bring themselves to actually declare war. We just have military, adventures, basically. So they can't actually declare war, because then you would have to end it. And then they, keep pushing National Defense Authorization Act, which actually restricts your rights. It's unconstitutional in many ways. So they'll deal with the unconstitutional thing called the National Defense Authorization Act, because they don't want to do the constitutional thing and actually declare war, because we shouldn't be over there unless we're declaring war. So they won't do that constitutional thing, but they'll do something unconstitutional. And then after not doing, be willing to declare war, or, they go and put sanctions and then limit the constitutional authority of the president. Seems like this Congress is making themselves illegitimate, because they're basically telling you that the Constitution is null and void. The proper response from the American people should be, okay, then your authority is null and void. Because that is where your authority comes from. So now you made yourself null and void, which were calling you null and void. Therefore, the unconstitutional things you did were null and void. And now we have to elect a whole new Congress because you guys wrote yourselves out of power, which was unconstitutional. So once you're out of power, we'll have to elect a new constitutional Congress. Sounds good to me. Except we know that the election would be crooked and just be one of their buddies in one of these seats. I'm going to dive here into Ron Paul Liberty Report, talking about this sanctions bill. And Ron Paul's calling it another deep state victory. So here we go.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today, Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. It is a good morning. I wish the world goodness and grace and peace, but we'll have to sort it out.
Yes.
I guess our president wasn't listening carefully to our program because we had suggested rather strongly that this sanction bill wasn't in our best interest. It wasn't making America first, and it was very complex. It looks like the House and the Senate were overwhelmingly in support of, escalating the conflict with Russia. So, but he did go ahead and sign it. He had some reservations which might be helpful. The argument was there was a slight delay and that Trump has a moral victory because he said that he was holding back for one thing, that he would have the authority to remove the sanctions if he saw fit. With Russia. But the deep state people, who generally are very much in charge, said, no, that's way too much authority for the president. So that is the most controversial, and that's the only thing that Trump said he was questioning. But then again, the whole principle of sanctions was fully endorsed by the people in Washington. But I don't think when the American people know about it, they'll say, hey, this is great. We love going in this direction because it's going to make a more peaceful world, because it won't.
Yeah, that's indeed. And he did question the constitutionality in a signing statement. He said he has some reservations. It erodes presidential authority. He said he'll carry out the law, however, but he'll do it consistent with his constitutional authority. And there's probably some wiggle room in interpretation. But, the bill itself, it cites Russia for a three-fact coup on Ukraine, Russian aggression in Syria. Well, Russia came into Syria at the request of the legitimate government of Syria. How is that aggression? And, of course, interference in U.S. elections, which is unproven. The only other thing about signing the bill is that, okay, he signed the bill, but yesterday Pence was in Georgia, I think, and he said the president and Congress are on the same page when it comes to Russia, talking about the bill. This is a bad bill. This is tying our hands. It's not good. The president's unhappy. So his own cabinet is in disarray, I think.
Yeah, and we haven't been too happy with some of those appointments, but there are days now that I'm sort of glad that Tillerson's there doing a little bit of challenging on this. So this is the whole thing. But, there was an interesting article yesterday by Federico Persini, and he talked a lot about the deep state and how all this stuff comes together. And I found that very fascinating. And of course, he was dealing with this whole subject of what you just mentioned, this conflict and why the sanctions are put out. But I thought he came across pretty objective in this article about how the ducks are lining up and what the ultimate goal is of the deep state, because he really was talking about the deep state here, and he talked about it in a way that he brings it together without claiming, well, I know these 6 individuals are in charge of the deep state. It's not quite like that. Yeah. But it's interesting on the people behind the scenes and out in the open are able to get the Congress to go along, with promoting the conflict. Because I think if there was a hands-off understanding and Trump had his way with Russia, I don't think we'd be talking about the building up of this conflict. I mean, like accusing Russia oh, they're planning to invade the Baltics, you know, this sort of thing. So it's just aggravated, and somebody wants it to be aggravated. Somebody wants chaos, and somebody wants us to be fighting with Russia, and there are several groups that would like to see that.
Yeah, and the piece, we noticed it on Zero Hedge, and if someone out there wants to read it, Sabotaging Russia-U.S. Relations for Good is the title, and it really is worth a read. It struck both of our attention this morning, and I think the reason why is because he very succinctly, I think, put things together in a way, as you say, that seems pretty objective. You know, he said two things. The deep state tried to sabotage any rapprochement with Russia. The first thing they did was the U.S. bombing of Syrian troops in Deir ez-Zor. And this was under the Obama administration when they first announced a ceasefire, and that blew that up. And he says the second sabotage was the sanctions bill, which has gone through and it was successful. And I think he gives a nice little synopsis of what the deep state wants strategically from the U.S. It's based on the continued need for the U.S. to have enemies requiring major arms investments. Surprise, surprise. He calls it the 4+1 theory. We have to maintain as enemies Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the +1 is terrorism. And that would give the excuse to have the U.S. military empire essentially over most of the globe. And I think it really explains a lot of what's happening, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that the indication is that the neocons got very frightened to think that we were getting way too friendly with the country and that we could get along because they need chaos and they need the incentive to be involved, maintain the empire, also these alliances. But it's interesting that two of the countries that are most involved in directing our foreign policy, and they are so different in many ways, but they are very much in tune with promoting this policy of fighting with Russia. And that, of course, is Saudi Arabia, which can't stand, the Iranians. And then we have Israel that doesn't want to see this because they see that a threat to their security. But they are very much together. And yet, if you listed what the Saudis believe in and what the Israelis believe in, philosophically and theologically and so many other things, and the principles of democracy, it's so different. But on this is very, very important. And they want this to happen because they correctly see it, that the success of Assad and the Russians right now has some significance to it. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but it's just significant for the neocons because it goes against their plans. And I keep thinking, that so far, most of this thing going on in 15, 18 years has helped the Iranians, and they're supposed to be our big enemies. So it's helping the Iranians. And now, of course, we've known for a long time, even at the beginning of the invasion of Afghanistan, we talked about, oil pipelines, how we get gas line into Europe. And I think it's something that looks like the Shia Crescent is a real possibility, and it's building. And then when I look at the map and I look at the long-term strategy of China, that if China ever gets even closer to this group, you're talking about a large segment of the world population, especially if they get this modern-day Silk Road in, and I understand they spend a lot of money on it already, and that sort of connects these countries. And as we get weaker, it's going to be more available to them. But I think this article pointed out that one of the strategies, they're internationalists in the sense that they're opposite of Trump. It's not America first. It's internationalism, and maybe America has just overstepped their bounds, and we have to tone it down and take some of this power and authority away from America because maybe they don't think we're doing the right thing, and now they're strongly in support of chaos, and they feel almost obsessed with making sure that we fight with Russia, and they're winning. And not only are there outside forces doing this, but they're inside too. When we have no idea which side the CIA is on and whether they orchestrate foreign policy or what. But we also know that, domestically, they're very much in control of how the Congress works. And the strategy right now looks, in the big picture, it looks like the neocons aren't doing badly.
Yeah, and then one thing they are good at, they're not good at creating democracy overseas, but they're very good at creating chaos overseas. So that's one thing they're doing.
That serves their interest.
That serves their interest. But, I think this part about Israel and Saudi Arabia was very interesting because he talks about, of course, this is objectively two of the strongest foreign lobbies in Washington, D.C., the Saudi and the Israeli lobby. Absolutely true. The deep state, he says, is sympathetic to the two lobbies, which I think is pretty accurate. But he also points out that the way Syria is going right now is the sort of the worst imaginable for the Saudis and the Israelis, who have invested so heavily in overthrowing Assad. Because if this U.S. pull out of support for the CIA's, supporting the jihadists there, if that really is a fact, and it looks like a Syrian government victory over ISIS and over the opposition, you're going to have a Syria led by Assad, allied with Hezbollah, Russia, Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq. So it really is the opposite turnout of what Iran or of what Israel and Saudi Arabia wants. So what's the next move?
This makes me think about what could have been. What if there were solutions that were more local and working for peace? Well, if the Saudis can get along with Israel, why couldn't the Saudis get along with Assad? But the reason is, I think, it's Saudis against the Persians. That is long-term, and it's control of oil, it's financial, it's probably banking, military-industrial complex, and all of this. But in theory, you could make the case and said, well, they should be capable, some of these people should be capable of putting up with Assad. It's been done in the past. Wasn't after 9/11, didn't Assad actually offer some troops or support for the...
He did help the U.S., yeah.
They were offering, and I think Iran did too. They were exchanging some of the radicals, but but still, then we come along, we get Trump, who gives a little bit of hope and a little bit of more independent thinking. So he says, yeah, we should talk to the Russians, but we can't talk to those terrible Iranians. They're the really bad people.
Yeah. And he says, let's talk to the Russians, and then everyone he has, maybe with the exception of Tillerson, is a Russia hater, is virulently anti-Russia for no reason. But the other thing that struck me in the article I thought was really good is the way he outlined Trump's struggle with the deep state. And it's probably an overused term, but for lack of a more accurate one, I think it's good to use. That he points out, and this just makes a lot of sense. He tried to placate the deep state at first by offering Flynn's head on a platter. He thought he was going to make a deal. Okay, I'll give you this, guys, back off. But in reality, it didn't work. So then he admitted that the Russians were involved somehow in the elections. He didn't want to, but he admitted something like this. He thought that was throwing them a bone. That didn't work. Then he launched missiles at Syria on a fictitious idea that they use gas. That didn't work. And what the author says is now basically he's out of ammo, and the coup de grace is the sanctions bill. His hands are tied, and it sounds like a checkmate.
Yeah, and he and Trump and Putin had this meeting, and as a consequence of that, there was this ceasefire, which seems to almost be a capitulation from the neocons' argument side, a capitulation that the Assad faction has won, and the Russians have won. This makes the neocons so upset. And this is probably very significant in that it's incentivizing the neocons here at home. They've maybe given up on using the military approach, and that's why the sanction approach has come, and the building up of the animosity, against Russia. And everybody's vulnerable if you cherry pick all the things that you're going to accuse somebody of. Mm-hmm. But the incessant, continuous 24 hours a day that the Russians are coming, they finally have an effect. But it doesn't look like the neocons are going to be very happy. They're looking to this. I think they've decided they have to destroy Trump. because he's unreliable. He's not one of us. And matter of fact, yesterday we talked about the new foreign policy. They don't even like libertarian. But at least Trump is not controllable, even though he's been hurt by capitulating on occasion, and then he got stung, so it's up for grabs. So I think their ultimate goal, of course, is to destroy Trump, and chaos is coming, and who knows what will be the consequence.
And the thing that makes it even more difficult for Trump, is that the liberals have aligned with the neocons on this. They are both really together on this idea of pushing the Russia thing to the point where the president, and here are two superpowers that could destroy the earth, and they meet a couple of times on the fringes of this summit, and somehow it's collusion. Somehow, how dare he meet and talk with this guy? See, that just proves it. It's gone beyond the realm.
But you have to expand the definition of liberals. There's a few in the Republican Party, too. So you have the old line party hacks that don't like Trump, anybody but Trump.
Yeah.
They get along with this, and they work with the Democrats now. And, of course, there were some people who were delighted, and I have no personal love for any political party, and the Republican Party was not necessarily the vehicle to bring peace and prosperity to this country. So they got together, and they think they're going to solve the problem this way. But I'll tell you, the Democrats and the Republicans, are the problem, and they may well destroy both parties. The Democrats, it's amazing how they get the attention on the Republicans are falling apart. They did it even before the election.
Yeah.
The Republicans were on the defensive, and then that happened. But now the Republicans are divided, and you have the Democrats here that they don't know what they stand for because they both stand for a philosophy that doesn't work. Yeah. Then you have the Republicans there doing this, and then they're all outside that. But it's probably Trumpism against those who are coalescing together. All the interventionists, liberals, moderates in the Republican Party, who will work, with the Democrats and socialists and all these other people. Whether it ever gets named a party, I think that's where the power is, and I think that's where the neocons are, and that's why this political chaos in this country is not going to go away. I think as the economy comes down, the blame is going to be there, and I think the Federal Reserve can bring the economy down whenever they want to, and I think that Trump has set himself up for a real experience by bragging about how he brought about this great health in the stock market. Everybody's wealthy now, so I think it's a very, very shaky, and that may be the crowning blow. Because all of a sudden, if we start acting like if we can't afford free health care for everybody, people are going to start talking and thinking like they live in Venezuela if we're not careful. What do you have to say for a summary?
Well, I think there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and I think it is the wild card. We've alluded to it in many shows in the past, and that's polls that have shown the American people are with us, more or less, in the vast majority, opposing war, concerned about war, not liking aggressive foreign policy. I think the American people are the wild card in this. The question is, what will they do? What can they do? How can they keep themselves from being propagandized? It's a big question.
Right. And I found this article and what we're talking about fascinating because it's talking about the deep state. There was a time when you mentioned deep state and you were written off. You're some type of conspiracy nut. But everybody uses the term now. And it is not a monolith. There's not a group of 6, 8, 10 people who control it. It's a coalition. And I think it's an ideological coalition that brings together a country like Israel and Saudi Arabia. And everybody acts in their own self-interest and they have influence. And that's what happens in pure democracy. Everybody say, we got to go around the world and spread democracy. But look at what it has spread in this country. Pure democracy. All you have to have is the clout of 51% of vote, and then you become the dictatorship of the majority. And but the deep state is there, but I think it's philosophic, and it's different forms of interventionism. Of course, we would like to lead the charge against interventionism when the government pursues it in the wrong sort of way, that is, controlling our lives, the economy, or foreign policy. But the coalition of individuals who want to rip up the status quo in order to reorganize the world, they want chaos. And that's one of the goals that they talk about. Maybe the end of the American empire is coming, and we have Trump that's challenging that, and a lot of people are sympathetic to it. But I tell you, there's a lot of people out there that are going to be affected, and they should be concerned. But we need to sort it out. But I think understanding what's going on behind the scenes and how the system operates and how they can automatically take a situation where there was a bit of a peace dividend, us traveling and trading and friends with Russia, then all of a sudden flipped over and become a daily occurrence. And I think of the two major incidents was the previous administration. One was the coup in Ukraine, and the other one was Assad has to go. And that is very, very aggressive, and it was done, in a party that was supposed to be less militant. And since that time, we've had nothing but chaos. And all of a sudden, the preaching, the control, the media, and everything else is hate Russia. There's a war coming, and we have to support anything we can do to stop the evil Russians from tearing up the world. And I think that's very misleading. And, of course, if we stick to our guns about dealing with what's best for America, which means that we ought to have peace and prosperity through a financial system and an economic system that recognizes individual liberty, we would do a lot better off if we could do that. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. Now, I have another article here covering this. Let me get it popped up here. Here it goes. Russia PM. New U.S. sanctions amount to full-scale trade war. Moscow, Reuters. New sanctions on Russia, which U.S. President Donald Trump has signed into law, are tantamount to a full-scale trade war, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev said on Wednesday. He also said in a Facebook post that the sanctions showed the Trump administration was utterly powerless. Quote, the hope that our relation with the new American administration would improve is finished, he wrote. So that from Reuters, which a lot of this, I think, does have to do with the deep state on both sides, Republican, Democrat. They don't want better relations with a lot of countries. We always hear the fear mongering, but the thing is, a lot of what they say happens here in the U.S. It's just not on our national news. These things do get reported by other countries' news organizations. So the way we see, you might be fooled into looking at a different country other than ours. They kind of look the same way at us. Now, culture and all that also takes, a amount on that society. Cultures really dictate. And we have so many different types of cultures in the U.S. And that goes from, urban to rural to suburban to more race or sexual identity, or, there's many different cultures, where in a lot of these other countries, a lot of those cultures are suppressed. And that's something that, we're able to get past here in America. we always have these groups always pushing for their rights. They're usually politically backed and motivated. Whether the people on the street that are doing the protesting realize, that they're being used, and this goes back in American history for a long time. It's what helped push, eugenics and all this. But we still have that freedom where, gay people are able to come out and be openly gay now. We get past, there's different cultures, there's different belief systems. But it also causes a lot of infighting, and the more authoritarian countries, they don't like, to have to deal with anything like that, which honestly they shouldn't unless someone's rights being abused. But they find it easier just to suppress, let's stick with this one culture. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but the nature of an authoritarian government never does last. And we're slowly working our way towards that. And what's going to further that along are these foreign relations. The more America is shut off by the rest of the world, and I'm not talking about, America withdrawing from being the policeman of the world, because we could do that. We've done that before. We've only become, a part of the global military presence mainly when there was major wars breaking out. Then, after World War One, we kind of slowly became back, let's focus on America. And then all of a sudden, World War Two and everything, and we end up back in it, and we really haven't gotten out since. But there was a little drawback from after World War One, but a lot of it was something that, our government, our society, and other circumstances all played a part in. But it's going to be a lot worse when the world decides to shut us off. And the world's already getting to a point where they're going, the U.S. just can't be the policeman of the world. We don't agree with it. And slowly but surely, they're working on ways to get around that. One thing that was mentioned was the new Silk Road. We know China and Russia have been working together with China's new currency to start undermining the U.S. dollar in the petrodollar. They don't want the U.S. dollar as a petrodollar. That's one thing that has artificially kept our dollar worth anything. So when sanctions like this hit, it's only going to further along what they want to do. And the simple fact that Trump could not stand up and go, you know what, you couldn't give me a health care bill, you couldn't give me this, you couldn't give me that, even though what bills did pop up were not good enough to even, well, I take that back. If we could have passed the repeal part, I think we could have at least edged our way, but they couldn't even do that. Trump's part of the reason why, because he kept going, we said repeal and replace. Well, sometimes we realize maybe you shouldn't replace it with any more government, dictation. It was collusion with insurance companies and government in the first place that has really made healthcare costs spiral out of control. You can thank collusion between healthcare providers and how they do that. They did that through fear, like they do almost everything. But if we think the way we're handling foreign relations, definitely, the deep state's handling its foreign relations. If you think that's beneficial, just give it some time, because it will turn around and backfire. We know it won't help our relations with any of these countries. If sanctions work so well, North Korea would have fell a long time ago. Sanctions only hurt the little people in these countries. Kim Jong-un is not suffering because of sanctions. His government officials are not suffering because of sanctions. But the people in that country are. Okay, let's move along here. Give me a second here. I'm a little bit issue again. Okay. We're getting her back up. There we go. There we go, guys. Sorry about that. Maybe not. Sorry, guys. It wants to load, but it just won't actually do it. While I try to get these articles back up, my other machine, I think, just crashed. I just had updates yesterday on it, so I don't know exactly how it's going to act. I've kind of held off on updating it because I tend to have a lot of problems when I do that. So let me go ahead and get this clip up. Next thing I want to kind of get into is immigration, because I had some articles that I had up, but we will get these articles back up once my machine here loads back up. Make sure my sound's off, otherwise you're going to hear Windows pop up. We'll go ahead and get in this clip. Stefan Molyneux, The Ugly Truth About Immigration. He has Peter Brimlow on, and it's really interesting. I'm not going to play this whole thing because I have some better articles, actually, that I do want to get up. So we'll go ahead and dive into some of this, and we'll get into these articles once I get them back up here.
From Freedom Main Radio, I'm here with Peter Brimlow. He is the founder and editor of VDare.com and the author of several books, including, I said, a little over 20 years ago now. I watched an old book talk that you did from 95, Alien Nation, Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster, and The Worm and the Apple, How the Teachers' Unions Are Destroying American Education. His website is VDare.com, and you can follow Peter on Twitter at twitter.com/Peter Brimlow. We'll put the links to all of that below. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time today.
It's an honor to be with you, Stefan.
So, if you remember from back in the day, the idea of a multicultural, multi-racist society was that we would all end up moving beyond racial concerns. I will say that as this experiment moves forward, the goal seems to become ever more illusory, in that as we get a multiracial society, we seem to become ever more obsessed with the problems of race. Now, I know that you have some theories behind that, but I wonder if you could give, especially some of our younger listeners and viewers, a sense of what has been going on in American immigration. Because, of course, everyone thinks, oh, it's just immigrant wave after wave after wave, nonstop, all the time. And there have been these significant pauses to allow for assimilation. And I think the argument is we're kind of due for one right about now.
Right. I mean, the thing is, Stefan, that America is not a nation of immigrants. It's a nation of settlers, and for most of American history, natural increase. People having children was what drove population growth. There have been waves of immigration. But in the part of the U.S. where I live, New England, after the Great Immigration of the 1620s, there was no immigration for another 200 years. So New England grew enormously quickly, but it was through natural increase. And that's why it was such a shock when the Irish arrived in the 1840s. So what you see in American history is that for most, after the Revolution, there was a long pause until the 1840s. And then immigration fell away again in the 1850s and 60s, and it started to surge in the 1880s. And when that happened, the Americans started to get unhappy about it, and they proceeded to gradually cut it off. And by the 1920s, they cut it off completely. And right through the 1920s, from the 1920s to the 1960s, really, there was essentially no immigration. In fact, there was net out migration in the 1940s. And then, of course, this was all reversed by the 1965 Immigration Act. And this triggered a great influx, which is vastly larger relative to the population growth than has really been seen before. And it will result. In the 1960 census, I believe the white Americans were 90% of the population. By 2040, which is not that long off, they will go into a minority because of public policy. The government is literally dissolving the people and electing a new one, to use the famous joke that Bertolt Brecht used after the 54 riots in East Germany.
Right. And it is interesting because not a lot of people know how specifically America was founded for Protestants from sometimes even particular sections of England, and that the idea was, of course, that the founding fathers had, that kind of cultural or ethnic composition was essential to maintain the freedoms and small government that they envisioned as the eternal future of the United States.
Right. I mean, I believe it's Jay specifically says in the Federalist Papers that we can make this federal experiment work because we're one people. We're descended from one common source with one religion. He didn't mean Christianity; he meant Protestantism. And of course, the 1790 Naturalization Act required it to be free and white. The Americans were ethno states, and they never thought anything about it. They just took it absolutely for granted. There was, of course, a black population there. But they were mostly slaves. They weren't part of the political nation. So, I mean, this may be a good thing or maybe a bad thing, but here's the thing, is what actually happened. And you have to ask yourself, how far can America stray from its historical foundations and still survive? And the answer is we're about to find out.
Well, we'll see where the future holds and how much that can be moved or shifted. And there is something that's really quite fascinating when you look across the world, fascinating / terrifying as these things tend to be, which is that if you look at the countries with the smallest governments, with the least corruption, with the most respect for contract and property rights, the classical liberal or libertarian ideals, they tend to be higher IQ countries for sure, if you look at things like Japan and South Korea and so on. But, of course, a lot of them are white countries. And it seems, the causality is always very confusing and goes down a rabbit hole of culture and religion and genetics and in-group preferences and so on. But why do you think that pattern seems to hold true across the world?
I can tell you why Milton Friedman thought it was. I used to do annual interviews with Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, when I was at Forbes, and I have them up on vdare.com. And I asked him, are there cultural prerequisites for capitalism? And he said, absolutely. For example, truthfulness, which is a cultural value. And then he went on to say, even more remarkably, that as far as he could see, capitalism had never actually worked in the form which we understand it, except in the English-speaking world. He said, I don't know why this is so, but the fact can't be denied.
And even, of course, when this idea was to supplant, as part of the empire was mercantilist and greedy and, color the map according to your state colors. But another part of it was considered to be sort of the white man's burden to try and say, hey, we kind of lacked or came across these wonderful principles, free market, small government, separation of church and state. Let's sow these seeds around the world so that everyone can enjoy the fruits of liberty that we have through happenstance and coincidence and hard work developed. And, man, it took for a little while. You look at South Africa, it took for a little while. But then when whites become a minority or when whites leave, there just seems to be this erosion and this backsliding to where they found it in the first place.
Yeah, and the British pretty well gave up mercantilism after the disaster of the American Revolution. And by the 1840s, they'd moved to a free trade empire, which was a paradox for them because, of course, they were confronted with protectionist powers like Germany and the U.S. The U.S. highly protectionist. In fact, in some respects, that's what triggered the Civil War, with the tremendous tariffs that they were imposing on the South. You're right. I think the roots of liberalism, classical liberalism, go back a lot further. I just happened to finish reading Churchill's biography of Marlborough, his great ancestor, and it's really amazing to read this thing. I've listened to it actually. In the early part of the 18th century, British generals had to deal with the fact that Parliament was constantly rebelling and cutting things off and causing trouble, and the king did not control Parliament. They actually had elections in the early 18th century, even though it was at the very best a form of aristocratic republic. But this issue of having to deal with free institutions goes very far back in English history.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem, the magic soil hypothesis that people come to a sort of Western country, their foot touches the ground and this weird libertarian electricity goes up their leg and rearranges their thought patterns and cultural history and religious preferences and so on. That is strange to me because a lot of this idea of assimilation and integration and multiracial societies comes from the left. And the left is notoriously intolerant towards ideas that go against their own view. Like the left would never say, well, we can bring in people from Somalia and they'll be just like people who came from England. But at the same time, they'd never say, well, we'll hire a bunch of Republicans and we'll just turn them into leftists. Like they themselves understand the intransigence and intractability of human ideas. And of course, political viewpoints do have a genetic basis to some degree. So they understand how inflexible Republicans are, but they somehow think that someone from sub-Saharan Africa is going to change magically.
Well, of course, actually, Stephen, as we both know, they don't think that at all. What they actually think is they're going to bring in a lot of people who are going to outvote whites in the whole society and thus elect a permanent left-wing government. That's what they think. They don't really intend to think that these people are going to operate like Americans or English, or Irish. The Irish situation is really bizarre. They really are. To me, I'm fascinated by Irish history. And to me, when you look at this long struggle for independence, that they would turn around and throw it all away like they are doing. On the one hand, submitting themselves to the European Union. On the other hand, allowing this tremendous immigration. It's just extraordinary. Very hard to explain. We have a lot of Irish readers who are really annoyed about it on VDAP.
Well, you've talked about this in many of your speeches, Peter, the extraordinary gap. It's not even opposite sides of the canyon. It's like opposite sides of reality or the universe. The extraordinary gap between what the elites want, what the media, the academics, and the politicians and so on, what they want and what the average person wants. I can't think of a time outside of direct civil war when there has been as much of a pushback against elite agendas as there is currently in the West about immigration.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I agree with you. I can't think of a parallel. You can see it related into the related issues. For example, my son, as you'll see behind me, was in the Marine Corps for 5 years, and throughout that time, the Marines were resisting strongly the idea of putting women in the front line, and they have all kinds of evidence as to why women can't do this. They get sick, they break down, all this kind of thing. And he said eventually they came to the conclusion that it didn't matter what they said, what evidence there was, the elite was just simply determined to impose this policy on them. Of course, you have to wonder what the motives are. It's obviously not going to work. They just want to destroy the Marines.
And that is something that
institution.
Yeah, we see this continually when leftists or social justice warriors move into an organization. They say that they want to reform it and improve it, but they generally end up with leaving a smoking crater where the credibility and efficiency and effectiveness of that organization used to be.
It's amazing to me. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. And when I was first in journalism, being anti-communist was a big problem. It was very close to being thought to be a racist now, because all of these media institutions were in one way or another influenced by the left. And then Russia collapsed, and communism went away. But damn it just recurred within a less short time. It just reinvented itself as cultural Marxism, in the process abandoning the working class. By the way, no interest in the working class at all, actually, and I don't think they ever did have. It was always about power.
I think that's true.
Now it's about manipulating different groups. You want to be able to appeal to people on the basis of their interest group, as identity politics.
Now, one of the things I find fascinating about the question or the label of racism is that if you have unjust negative characterizations in your mind or your language of other groups, clearly that's bigoted and that's negative. However, if you identify objective and empirical differences between ethnicities or races, that also seems so. Prejudice is under the category of racism, which I have no problem with, but science, facts, objectivity, empirical data also seems to fall under the general umbrella called racism, which seems to me extraordinary. I mean, to lump, it's like lumping fact and fiction under slander as the same category. It makes no sense to me at all, other than it shuts white people up from talking about in-group preferences.
It seems to me that the term racism has to mean prejudice. I don't see what else it can mean. And there's a difference, as you say, between being prejudiced on the one hand and being blind to facts on the other. And the issue of whether there are differences between racial groups in various ways is simply a question of science. Obviously we can't totally, blind ourselves to this. In British English, when I was living in Britain, which is, I left in 1970, they used to racial. And at various times, the blogger Larry Oster was very proud of calling himself a racist, because what he meant was he recognized the reality of race. But the problem in Britain, of course, is that people don't distinguish between racism and racialism. So I think what you've got to use is the term race realism, which means is there a real difference between the races? And of course, the answer is, as it turns out, that there probably is on average. Right. And that's completely unsayable. I mean, it's staggering to think. The bell curve came out the year before Alienation, 94, and it's 23 years ago, and we've made no progress in public debate at all. It's been completely repressed.
Sorry to interrupt. There've been a few cracks that have shown up lately. Charles Murray went on Sam Harris's podcast where they had a very civilized discussion about these things. But to me, the paradox, of course, Peter, is that the left gets really angry at anyone who says there may be behavioral patterns among different races, but then they seem to focus almost exclusively on bringing voting stock in from the third world. And it's like, well, if there were no discernible differences, if people from the third world voted exactly the same as white people from European sort of historical, then so if the idea was correct, that everybody is equal, then there would be no need to focus. You could have a very wide net when it came to immigration. But the fact that they're focusing, as you point out, on these 15 countries that bring in people who reliably vote 85% for the left means that their entire premise of immigration is based on the fact that ethnicities act differently, at least politically. But then anyone points it out, it's like the worst thing ever. It's like, but that's the entire basis of the policy.
I mean, it can only really be understood through George Orwell. There's, so there's some type of doublethink going on, and my observation is that if you're dealing with ordinary sort of lumpen leftists, they actually do successfully doublethink this. They genuinely do think that there's no difference between the races, while on the other hand behaving in a way that implies that they recognise it. It's a very bizarre situation, and we're headed for a hard landing here. We're headed for a hard landing. I don't see an easy way out of this. It could have been done, Stefan. Frankly, if anybody paid any attention to me when I wrote the Alien Nation '95, which flowed from a National Review article, incredibly, to think now, in '92, a cover story I did on immigration. If we could have returned really substantively to America in the 1960s, before the Act, if we'd cut off at that point, immigration off at that point, but we didn't.
And there is something that I read recently about the Japanese government, who, like all governments, I guess, are being pressed to take in more refugees from sub-Saharan Africa and other places. And they say, no, sorry, our primary responsibility is towards our own citizens. Now, in America, a lot of people, and in Europe, of course, they will think about things like terrorism and so on. And while those issues are important to me, they fade in significance relative to the fact that immigration is fundamentally a class issue. And it is the lower classes who suffer the most from these endless waves of low-skilled immigrants. Because, one of two things happen. Either the immigrants work productively, in which case they're driving down wages for unskilled laborers, particularly blacks and Hispanics, or they don't work, in which case they're driving up taxes for everyone else because of the welfare state, which, if they're raising taxes on the rich, that means fewer jobs for the poor. If they're raising taxes on everyone, then the poor have even less money to get by. And the idea that a greater obligation is owed by the American government to people all over the world relative to their own citizens is an incomprehensible. It's not even a nullification of the idea of nationalism or in-group preference. It's a complete reversal of it.
Right. And yet we're very close to having that written into the law by the American judiciary. I mean, their reaction to the travel ban is simply extraordinary. They seem to feel that these people have a right to come into the country. And they're in the process of writing that into American law through the judicial legislation, which, of course, is one of the great curses of American politics.
Oh, yeah. Judicial activism and the overturning of the Constitution through precedent seems to be pretty much how the left advances its agenda, again, without putting things to the vote of the population. And this is we can focus a little bit on the 1965 Immigration Act, which was such a pivotal change. It was never submitted to the American public with any facts. It was never submitted with any accurate projections. It was supposed to be a minor, relatively cosmetic tweak that was not going to alter demographics. Sure. So it was sold as a fraudulent bill of goods and has been escalated ever since and never put to the vote. Right.
It was held up as represented to be a purely symbolic thing. And of course it wasn't at all. The interesting question is, did they know that at the time? And I think there are people who framed that legislation who knew perfectly well what it was going to do. They knew they couldn't go to the American people and tell them that.
Well, which group would ever vote for demographic replacement? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. This is unprecedented in human history that outside of invasion, that a population has been subjected to this kind of replacement. It is truly astonishing. So I wonder if you can help people understand what changed between 1964 and 1966 regarding immigration, and particularly the chain migration and the family issues.
Well, what they did was they reoriented immigration. First of all, prior to 1965, there were large parts of the country where you couldn't immigrate to the U.S. from, and that was all changed. And they introduced global quotas on it right across for every country across the world. But they also allowed family unification became the key principle, and the family unification is defined very broadly in the U.S. So that caused chain migration to happen because, of course, every remote relative could then sponsor his remote relatives, and that swamped the country quotas. They rapidly the total inflow was rapidly seized by just a relatively small number of countries from the third world, and it's very hard to immigrate to the U.S. if you don't happen to come from one of these countries. Where they've got this enormous chain migration coming in from.
Right. And the numbers, I wonder if you could help people get up to date, particularly the European listeners. What kind of numbers are we talking about since 1965 into America?
Well, we're talking about 1 million a year legal immigrants. Of course, also at the time, in the late 60s, the borders collapsed. They stopped enforcing the law at the border. So this caused a new surge of illegal immigration. I say a new surge because there had been a very similar surge in the early 50s. And Eisenhower cut it off in just a few months when he came into power with his Operation Wetback. They moved about 1.5 million people out of the country. They didn't deport that many of them. But once the people realized, they deported about 200,000 to 300,000. When they realized that they'd been deported, the rest left. And to some extent, we see that happening now, by the way. There's evidence that there is a significant outflow of illegal immigrants from the U.S. at the moment because they believe what they read in the papers. They actually believe the mainstream media. They think Trump's going to rounding them up and throwing them out. Particularly in the first months of his administration, that was a very effective technique, and people did self-deport. There's a dispute as to whether that's slowing now, but we'll see in the numbers as they come out in the next few months.
Well, and the influx is diminishing as well because they don't want to know, or they don't know what's going to happen in terms of U.S. policy. And of course, the mainstream media is trumpeting all of this, deportation forces and so on. But at least, the ICE officials are now being permitted in some situations to actually enforce the law and to earn their paycheck. And so that, of course, is giving people this uncertainty. Do we want to go in there because we don't know what's going to happen? And that is changing, I think, some of that already.
And we see on the H-1B visa, which is a type of a guest worker program, that the number of applications has fallen very dramatically. It's still above the quota, but it has fallen quite a lot. And that's presumed because they feel that they're less welcome and they're more subject to the law actually being enforced. It's harder for them to change jobs and so on. I mean, I should be more precise. What looks like it's might be slowing, or more accurately increasing, is the influx seems to be creeping up again in the last couple of months. It's nowhere near what it was, but it is creeping up a bit. On the other hand, the exodus is still continuing, so the net is lower. And the growth of the foreign-born population in the U.S. has slowed quite significantly. And, you don't have to do a lot to get it to slow, because we ran an article on VDare.com from somebody on the border, and he was one of the Border Patrol people, and he was saying they're watching people go out, they're waving them through, they don't make any effort to check who they are, and they're carrying all their consumer goods, washing machines and stuff like this. And you see, the reason is that they know it's extremely disruptive to have a family member deported, and they may have to abandon their property and stuff like that, and they don't want to do that, so they take it and go back to Mexico. That's why self-deportation actually will work.
Well, I think that's true. People respond to incentives, and you don't have to grab everyone by the neck and throw them over the border. If the incentives change, I mean, if the law, which originally I think was the case, but has not been enforced for many years, that immigrants into America should not be able to receive welfare for 5 years. I mean, I tell you, Peter, this was an astonishing time for me when I was looking into this stuff to begin with, because I generally read the law and thought that had something to do with the way things that work. So I remember thinking, oh gosh, it must be terrible, living under bridges, skulking from place to place, working only in cash and so on. And then it's like, oh no, you can get welfare, you can put your kids in school, you can get health care and so on. I'm like, what? How is that possible? The only way you get 4 hearts in a cart by breaking the law elsewhere is to go to jail. And the amount of access that illegal people, criminals have to taxpayer-funded social services and educational resources is truly astonishing to me. It was when I first found out about it.
The key loophole is the birthright citizenship proviso, which arguably is a misinterpretation of the 14th Amendment. But for many years, the children of people in the U.S., anybody born in the U.S. is treated as an American citizen. Now, as a practical matter, that meant if you're an illegal immigrant here, you can't be deported because you have an American citizen child. We call them anchor babies for that reason. But it also meant they had access to all kinds of welfare that the American citizen child will be receiving, which you get to spend. And then, of course, there's the public education issue, I mean, that's a transfer of up to 10, depending where you are, but an average of about $10,000 a year from the taxpayer to the child. And there's a real question as to whether illegal immigrants' children should be in school. There was one of the more disastrous Supreme Court rulings in the 70s, Plala versus Doe, on that. But it's never been fully litigated, and it could well be reversed now because the judgment was made on various empirical grounds, that this isn't going to be burden on the taxpayer and all that kind of thing. Things that judges should not be concerning themselves with, but they of course do. But in any case, the point is even that argument has been refuted now. It is a burden on the taxpayer, so it should be litigated. I think that the birthright citizenship thing is, I mean, if I had been Trump, it's the first thing I'd have gone for, because what it does is it means that these people who are born here will not become citizens, and therefore they can't vote. And that's the key thing. In the end, it's not terrorism. It's not the economic impact. It's the fact that they're going to vote Americans out of their own country. That's what is a really dangerous thing about immigration. And it's particularly dangerous for legal immigration because they actually are here legally and they can become citizens very quickly. And, of course, the Democrats are doing their best to make sure that happens.
Well, American citizenship is one of the great prizes in the world. And the idea that committing an illegal action by being in America and giving birth to a child confers upon the child legal citizenship is the idea that one should keep and profit eternally from the proceeds of a crime. That to me is astonishing. Like you steal the car's returned to its owner and you go to jail. You don't get free gas for the rest of your life and get to keep the car as well.
And more specifically, the children of burglars do not get to keep the goods that the burglars stole.
Right.
And that's why I think that this idea, this deferred action, the DACA thing, is madness as policy. The fact that you're not going to deport the children who are brought here, people who are brought here as small children or as babies and so on, that they somehow are in a special category, strikes me as lunacy. Particularly because, I have children who are just out of college, It's very tough for these kids just out of college now, trying to find jobs. And these DACA recipients are going to be competing with them directly. What's the point of that? Why make the labour market worse for college graduates than it already is? But, of course, there seems to be real elite enthusiasm. They're basically trying to find a way of not having to deport these people. And they think that's an easier way in to say, well, they came here as children.
Well, and the funny thing is, too, is that there is this perception that is going to be very enraging and upsetting to the Hispanic population who is in America illegally. But I think that there's significant evidence to say that the Hispanic population who came to America legally, I assume came to America because they didn't like Mexico as much. Right. And so the idea that Mexico is, the giant sombreros coming up in the rear view and Mexico is going to kind of overtake what they escaped, to me does scant justice to the people from Mexico who arrived legally and who went through all those hoops and paid all that money and then are going to look resentfully at the people who just wander across the border and get all of these rights.
Yeah, we have articles on VDare.com from Mexican immigrants who make exactly this point. We're always portrayed as white nationalists. VDare is a forum site. I'll run anybody who's critical of immigration, no matter what their background or their other political beliefs are and so on. And we regularly get articles and letters from immigrants and people of all races who are unhappy about the situation. It's the Hispanics who really get it in the ear from this current immigration because they're in direct competition from new immigrants coming in. One of the amazing things about this current situation in the U.S., Stefan, is there's really not been enough thinking about the Trump election. I don't mean in terms of what he was saying, but technically. He won that election, as you know, by spending very little money. And that's interesting. There's a whole industry of political consultants who hate him for that. But he also showed that you don't have to pander to Hispanics. He didn't even have a Spanish language website. He certainly had no Hispanic consultants. He didn't do any worse than Romney did with Hispanics. The whole thing is a complete farrago. Of course, the category of Hispanic should not exist. They've invented it in a way to maximize it's been set up in a way to maximize the number of people they can try and appeal to on the basis of being you're Hispanic. It's not a linguistic category because they speak all languages. It's not a racial category because because they are all kinds of different races. Linda Chavez, you remember the neocon luminary she was actually nominated to be Bush's Labour Secretary, I believe, but turned out she was employing illegal aliens, so she wasn't confirmed. But she told me once that her own children, her husband's last name is Guzman, and so her own children, it's not Guzman, it's not a recognized, it's a Jewish name, it's not a recognizable Hispanic name, but the first name was Pablo, because her family hasn't spoken Spanish for several generations. They're from New Mexico. But when the Maryland education bureaucracy saw that they had Spanish first names, they put them in a Spanish immersion. They put them, which they didn't speak because they're just trying to maximize the size of this client group. I think the Census Bureau should abolish the category. And we've got to go to precise racial categories in this country because that's what the reality we've created.
Well, this is the other thing, too, which is to say that all races are the same, and we could say mestizo rather than Hispanic. All races are the same, but you have to change your message for the black group, and you have to change your message for the Hispanic group or the mestizo group. And it's like, well, which is it? If you have to alter your political message and pander to concerns of every particular group, then clearly you're saying that these groups are going to fragment your political unity. They're going to fragment the value system that is the underpinning of your society.
The thing that really terrifies the left right now is that someone is going to figure out a way of appealing to American whites on the basis of their identity, Up to now, they've been able to persuade people that any kind of reference to the white vote and so on is illegitimate and wrong. And, when we first started writing in VDARE, after 2000 election, we started writing stuff saying that as a matter of simple arithmetic, it would make more sense to the Republicans to appeal to their white base and mobilize that, rather than trying to penetrate these various minority groups, And we found that the reaction from the establishment was hysterical. I mean, for example, there's this site, Free Republic. I don't know if it's still going, but it's basically an aggregation site. We were banned from Free Republic. People were no longer allowed to post stuff from VDARE on Free Republic because we'd argued that the Republicans should go after the white vote, and this is clearly racist. And this is supposed to be a conservative site, Of course, that's exactly what Trump did. Somehow he was able to appeal. He found some way of appealing to American whites implicitly, without actually making racial arguments. Because he didn't really make racial arguments. They said he did, which is actually part of the game. Because people assume, he must be making racial arguments. Maybe he's on our side. But he didn't make direct racial arguments. Somehow he was able to appeal to them in some kind of implicit way. That's the spectre of death itself for the left. They must keep whites in the U.S. from uniting because they could unite and they could stop this before it's too late. And they're desperate that that not happen. And that, I think, explains a lot of the hysteria in American politics from the left at the moment. That they know it could be taken away from them. They really thought that Hillary was going to be able to, it really was the Flight 94 election. Is that the term? That she was going to come in, she was going to appoint another Sotomayor or wise Latina to the Supreme Court. They were going to, the Supreme Court has shown that it's willing to, the left on the Supreme Court has shown that it's willing to do anything. I mean, if you can find gay marriage in the Constitution, you can say that the First Amendment doesn't guarantee free speech, the Second Amendment doesn't guarantee gun ownership. They can say anything they want. It's just a question of absolute power, And they were on the verge of getting that. She would have opened the borders. She would have vastly increased the refugee influx, what we used to refer to as doing the full Merkel. They would have this tremendous influx, and they would knock out the white population of the U.S. They were right on the verge of doing that, and they're extremely annoyed that they haven't been able to do it.
Right. Which is why they have to find a white Christian country as their scapegoat, which is Russia. And yeah, it was an absolutely consequential election to the point where I actually entered into the political fray for the first time in my public career and chose sides, because it was not hard to figure out that this was a referendum on whether America continues in its current form or turns into something far different. And this, to me, is another thing that's well worth mentioning about what was about to happen. Yeah, Hillary would have gone full Merkel, as you point out. And what's happening now, if white people, and in particular white males, I mean, white males are the tax livestock of the redistributionist state. There's no question of that. And of course, as the tax livestock, you don't want them becoming self-aware. You don't want them to start to defend their own interests. So you can have a Hispanic group called La Raza, which of course, as you know, literally means the race, and that's fine. And you can have a black congressional caucus. But the moment that white people say, okay, well, wait a minute, things are kind of slipping away here. We're going to become a minority in the country our ancestors founded. So we set to start organizing and protecting our own interests the way that all other groups do. Suddenly everyone's in the KKK. And that is really shocking and tells you the exact agenda that is going on, which is to keep white people quiet, to keep their shoulders to the yoke, to have them continue to produce things that can be snatched up by the state and redistributed to other groups. And, I wish it wasn't that way. I wish, we could all be a little bit less racially conscious. But sadly, that's just not the way politics and demographics are heading.
Some years ago on VDARE.com, we had a multi-part debate between Jared Taylor, who runs American Renaissance on the one hand, and Steve Saylor, who's a columnist of ours on the other, about white nationalism versus citizenism. Saylor has this concept that, what he calls citizenism, which is that Americans can unite on a civic nationalist basis rather than explicitly racial basis. Jared argued that they couldn't for various reasons. He's abandoned, by the way, the term white nationalism now because he thinks it's hopelessly smeared. So he calls himself a white advocate. But that irritates me because I think white nationalism is a perfectly fine term. I think it's a legitimate point of view. Now, my heart is with the citizenists. I want to believe that we can all get along, to quote to whatever his name was down in the Los Angeles riots. And it warms my heart when I see we get these letters from Mexicans and blacks and so on saying that the supporters and everything. But I do think that my head says that things are going to precipitate out on racial lines. In the end, it's not going to be possible to keep this thing going because of the continued influx. It's just goading people to think in terms of racial categories, particularly when you have policies like affirmative action and so on. I mean, at some point, people are going to start to count about, why is it that there are so few whites in general and white Christians in general at the elite Ivy League universities? It's because they're caught in a vice. On the one hand, there are preferential quotas for blacks and Hispanics. On the other hand, there are no quotas against Asians and Jews, you see. So the result of that is that the white Christians are actually substantially underrepresented in the Ivy League. Now, at some point, they're going to figure this out. Pat Buchanan mentioned it when he was campaigning, and he was, of course, immediately announced in the usual way for saying it. But eventually, it's not going to be possible to suppress this.
I think, to this historical parallel, let me know what you think, Peter. The historical parallel that pops into my mind goes something like this, that before the separation of church and state, you had groups jostling for control over state power. And as long as the state has the power to redistribute between groups, and as long as groups have self-identifiable characteristics like race that they can use to coalesce, to form together, and to attempt to hijack the political process to get resources for themselves. In other words, as long as there's no separation between state and race, as long as there is this power to redistribute, then people are inevitably going to form into gangs, form into groups, just like they do in prisons. They're going to form into gangs, voting blocks to attempt to get money from the state. As long as the state has this power to redistribute income, people are going to be, to some degree, defined by race and defined by power blocks to get resources from other groups. If the government no longer has the power, as it didn't at the beginning of America, and as it didn't for many years in the Western European experiment, if the government does not have the power to forcibly strip income from one group and to give it to another, then I don't care who's here, because people who are going to be here because they love freedom, not because they love the contents of my wallet.
Well, in general, I agree with that. But Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, once said that when you have a racially diverse electorate, all elections become about what tribe you belong to, regardless really of what the public policy is. In other words, even if the state is not very redistributionist, people are still going to organize themselves along racial lines. I mean, it's true that the U.S. was, the government share of the GDP was very, very small in the early years of the Republic, but it was also a very homogeneous society. So we didn't see this kind of rent seeking and even this kind of jostling for political power. That we do when it's racially divided. So I'm afraid I'm not quite as optimistic as you are. I mean, one of the biggest disappointments I've had in 25 years now in the immigration debate is the attitude of the libertarians. I mean, I was a financial journalist for 40 years, and I relied very heavily on the libertarian analysis. Way back when in the 70s, when we were all arguing about wage and price control and about taxes and that kind of thing. But I made in Alien Nation and a speech I gave to Property and Freedom Society, which is up on the side, arguments to why libertarians should care about immigration. Basically, it's a question of property rights. I mean, the people in the nation, in the state, have property rights, and they don't necessarily want to give those away to foreigners. There's a whole bunch of arguments, but libertarians just simply would not listen. In fact, they were extremely angry when they were forced to think about this question. So that's been a really profound disappointment to me. I used to, as a financial journalist, I used to rely very heavily on the Cato Institute and their work. And then when I realized that when I got involved in the immigration issue, I realized I just couldn't trust them. They just lied all the time. And that, of course, made me think, well, if they're going to lie about immigration, maybe they're lying about this other stuff as well. But then I stopped using Cato. I was much more skeptical and careful about using the Cato Institute's material when I was at Forbes after I got involved in the immigration debate, because it was a revelation to me how unscrupulous they were.
Well, it is going to, I mean, the whether it's genetics or environment still remains somewhat of an open question, but when we look...
Okay, I'm going to stop that right there. Now, I kind of want to go over some of what they talked about when it comes to race and environment. It really it doesn't have anything to do with the race. I think many people my age, maybe not the older generation, but maybe people my age that grew up with very, mixed race, high school society, how I grew up, there wasn't a huge racial divide, but there still was a class and a cultural divide. And I was one of the few people that, being a big school, high school, I would say one of the few people, but it really, there were quite a few people that were like me where, I got along with a little bit of everyone, but there were their groups. Now, of course, everybody knows about, the rocker clique over here and, the pop group over here, and they would be mixed. You would have the black kid that grew up maybe in more of a suburban type atmosphere. He grew up around these people. They jam out, listen to rock. You other than being able to see his skin color, if you're colorblind completely, where you couldn't tell someone's skin color, you wouldn't know, because that's the culture that person grew up in. They didn't relate to maybe the black guy that was into gangster rap. Now, there tends to be at times of extreme tension. Sometimes people will go with, oh, those are the black guys, I gotta be with the black guys. But that always falls under authoritarian control. Example, prisons. You're locked in a box and you have to group up to stay alive. And the quickest, the easiest way is by skin color. And in those authoritarian type things, it also creates a lawlessness within, which you tend to see that if you look at communist countries, socialist countries. When the society falls and things are hard to get, when you do get things, they're usually controlled by a criminal element. Sometimes that criminal element might have government backing, where the government knows and allows it to operate. Sometimes it's kind of behind the government's back. And you're seeing it in Venezuela. You see it every time they have a prohibition on a substance. Because under those authoritarian controls, you drive a criminal element. And you drive a divide in people. And so when you look at the whole race, is it, genetics, or it's definitely environment. And again, people my age, we grew up where if you had a group of black people that decided that, well, you have to act like them to be a black person, which again, that was that, you have to group up. You have to group up. Where what they seen in common was, well, most of my friends that listen to this gangster rap are black and they grew up in my neighborhood, where they don't see that black kid that grew up in the suburban environment growing up listening to rock and having maybe more white friends, or Asian and Hispanic, maybe some other black families. But what usually drives all this? I think if you look at the left and you look at the Democrats, you can really find your answer, and it's under that authoritarian control. Look at Chicago. It is one of the Democratic, strongholds. Chicago. It is extremely segregated. You literally have a train stop that after that that train stops there, very unlikely you will see another white person on that train, and vice versa. There's like this little gray area in Chicago where they'll kind of mingle some, but then they separate to their sides. And very rarely does you see a white person on the south side and a black person living on the north side. It's segregated. Where when you come over here to Indiana, even in some of the small rural towns, it might be a little bit more white, but there's plenty of blacks and Hispanics, and it doesn't bother anybody, and they might be your neighbor. And that's where I think you really do see where culture, atmosphere, really dictate. Because in one of the bigger cities that I grew up in, it really had to do whether you were from rural area, suburban area, or urban inner city area. And it didn't matter what color you were. And even if they decided to, let's say, maybe a white group, a Hispanic group, and a Asian group, and a black group, if they were all raised in urban, they all act the same. They all have the same tendencies. They all have the same way of thinking, but they will still divide themselves. But not always. And you start seeing a little bit of that fade when you get to the suburban area. The rural area, I think, is, in today, it's misunderstood. And I do know here in Indiana, there are parts of Indiana that have racists, but you can find that in a lot of states. But there's the rest of rural Indiana that really just, I don't care as long as, no one's causing me problems. Why would I care what color you are? I don't care who's breaking in my house. I don't want them breaking in my house, no matter what color they are. And that the crime tends to be pretty evenly distributed between all races. And I moved out. I don't know if you call me. I'm pretty much rural. I'm surrounded, but I live on a lake, so there's plenty of homes right around the lake, and then it's just surrounded by fields. But it really, no one cares. But you go up to Chicago, leave Indiana, also you hit Chicago, and you really do see a racial divide, and it's Democrat controlled. They're the party for the minority. Well, they're the party of division, whether you realize it. They unite people to divide. Yes, they're for the blacks. Yes, they're for the Hispanics. Yes, they're for the white people. Stay in your lane. And it's just so backwards. I want to play a little bit more of this clip, but I do want to cover these two articles. That's why I want to go ahead and stop that right there, because I really wanted to address that, because they have brought that up quite a bit. Now, when you bring in the immigration part, culture, again, is what plays a part. If you have a culture that marrying off your kids at 10 years old and being able to attack your neighbor because the color they painted their house, or you think they're, you know, gay, or, they're not of your religion. If you bring in people that believe in that type of culture and don't have any want or need to change that way of thinking, and you bomb their country and then let them in, what do you think you're going to get? What needs to be universal when we look at people coming to America, which the welfare state, if you get rid of that part, will actually help fulfill this, is people that are looking for the culture that they see. They're not moving to America to, flee the bombing because, well, we shouldn't be bombing them. They're not coming to America because we have all these free goodies that you can come. They're coming because they're going, this way of living here is not what I believe in. But I do believe in the freedom that America talks about and is supposed to represent. That's why I want to go there. One article here, where we are close to the limit. Big O becomes a shelter as refugees flow from U.S. Now, they talked about self-export, deportation, deporting yourself because you don't like how America is, or you're not getting free handouts. Outside the YMCA, on Tupper Street, downtown, near where the Children's Hospital used to be, dozens of Haitians newly arrived from the United States milled about Wednesday, clutching government documents and looking slightly lost, while Montreal Haitians of long standing came to lend a hand and load their cars with luggage. Haitians help Haitians, one volunteer explained. Jean Dormeus was among Montreal's flood of new arrivals, the Secretary General of Political Youth Group in the northern city of Cap-Haïtien. Dormeus, 23, fled 6 months ago when individuals threatened to kill him and his family, he said. Since his father was assassinated for similar reasons, Dormeus took the threat seriously. His mother and sister fled neighboring Dominican Republic and flew to Mexico, then crossed into San Diego to ask for asylum. He lived in Pennsylvania for 6 months, but in Donald Trump's America, Dormeus was told his chances for asylum were slim and odds of deportation strong. It's not good for us there now, he said. It's not safe in the U.S., and I can't go back to Haiti. So he surfed the internet for instructions on how to get to Canada. In June, took a bus to Plattsburgh, New York, then paid a taxi driver $70 for the 20-minute ride to the border. He crossed over, was promptly arrested by Canadian police officers, and requested asylum. At the Y, Haitians from the United States were lining up for rooms, but many were told they would be transferred because there was no more room at the inn. The increasing wave of Haitian refugee claimants forced officials to open a temporary shelter in the Olympic Stadium Wednesday while scrambling to keep up with a demand they feared shows no signs of slowing. And if you get through this, it also brings up Syrian refugees that were the first, now are Haitians. We had right here. I'm trying to get to this here. Sorry. Francine Dupius, who oversees PREDA, a government-funded program to help seekers get their feet in Quebec, said the number of refugee claimants is unprecedented. Following a recent wave of Syrian refugees, most are now Haitians fleeing the United States for fear their temporary resident status will be revoked, and hoping to find refugee in Montreal's large Haitian community. Quote, "It's unheard of," Dupius said. "In 30 years, I've never seen this kind of volume or intensity." Dupius said about 90% of asylum seekers coming into Quebec now are Haitian. In July, PREDA received 1,200 new requests for refugees, nearly 4 times more than average a month. We're doing our best, but obviously there's going to be a limit, and we are close to that limit. So now the country of Canada, the one that would want to criticize any country that might not want to let refugees just flood into their country, are now saying, yeah, we might have to put an end to this for a little while because this is just too much. Well, congratulations that you are seeing that there is a limit. Something that Germany and all these other European countries are not recognizing. That you can't have a flood of people that don't respect, don't like, and don't want to have any part of the culture of your country. Even though there are many cultures in the United States, all these cultures have also been raised to believe they have rights. Now, because of miseducation, a lot by the left of late, they might have a very construed belief of what's a right and what's a privilege, what you have a right to. You have a right to work hard and try to better yourself financially, knowledge. You don't have a right to take from others to get yourself there. We have a culture that we want to believe is based on freedom, even though we see that very quickly eroding. We want to believe that. I don't know if I'm going to have time to get to the rest of that clip, but one from Fox News: Trump, GOP senators champion bill to cut legal immigration levels. Not illegal, legal immigration levels. Not good if you're trying to keep illegals out. Because people that do need and want to come to the U.S. will still come. But now they won't be legal. President Trump joined 2 Republican senators on Wednesday to champion legislation overhauling legal immigration in America, calling for a merit-based system that would significantly cut admissions over the next decade. Speaking at the White House, the president called it the most significant reform to our immigration system in half a century. As a candidate, I campaigned on creating a merit-based immigration system that protects U.S. workers and taxpayers, and that is why we are here today, Trump said. He was joined by Georgia Senator David Perdue and Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. The Republicans who first introduced the Reforming American Immigration for a Strong Economy, or the RAISE Act, in February, they have said the legislation aims to reduce the number of green cards issued in half, from 1 million to 500,000 a year. Trump, Perdue, and Cotton argued on Tuesday that low-skilled and unskilled immigration into the United States has depressed wages. According to a fact sheet released to reporters, the new system would favor immigrants who are educated, speak English, and have high-paying job offers. It would also reduce low-skilled and unskilled labor immigration. Trump said new immigrants must be able to financially support themselves and their family. I'm not going to read the rest of that. That's at foxnews.com. But this is what irritates me. He wants he wants people that are going to have high-paying jobs. He wants to reduce low-skilled and unskilled labor immigration. Now, low-skilled and unskilled tend to be about the same. The people picking the fields or, doing very low-paying and hard-to-do jobs that, honestly, most people are raised to feel too privileged to work. I'll push a damn broom if that's what I need to do. But the problem with this is it kind of misses the whole allowing for immigrants in the first place, where Americans could work their way up. And then you needed people that could fill those spots. And, of course, you hope it to be American kids. But, again, do you know too many young American kids that will go handpick fields? Any race. That family born, raised for generations here in America, they'll go, oh yeah, I'll go pick tomatoes off, the vine throughout all these fields for low wages, because it doesn't take much skill to, watch and repeat. Minimum wage. The high school kid wants to go work at, Walmart for minimum wage or McDonald's for minimum wage. It's so flawed looking at it, and it's not going to be beneficial. The more and more Trump starts pushing these things, the more I know he's not anywhere close to liberty or freedom minded. Again, that article was at Fox News. I want to play a little bit more of this clip. I will stop it before the end of the broadcast, but let's go ahead and finish a little bit of this off.
IQ of sub-Saharan blacks being 70, then what happens when they move into a higher IQ society with a relatively free market, but a redistributionist state, is very predictable. It's extremely predictable what is going to happen. It's going to be like a caterpillar tracks on a tank, just going round and round, which is that they're not going to succeed. Very, very few of them are going to succeed in a higher IQ society, which means they're going to be dependent on the state, which means they're going to vote for bigger government, and they have no particular respect for property rights, because property rights is the opposite of taxation and therefore interferes with the redistribution that they want. And if let's say it's an all Japanese society and some Japanese group fails or some Japanese guy fails, well, you can't ascribe it to racism. And this is the big problem. As long as people are screaming racism and there are IQ differences that nobody knows how to remediate, certain groups are going to do well. Think of sort of Japanese and Chinese and South Koreans and so on, or Jews. Certain groups are going to do badly, mestizos and sub-Saharan blacks in particular. And then, because nobody can talk about race and IQ, the entire explanation that is made up is racism, which, again, is like, why would anyone want that entire trap that seems completely unavoidable at the moment?
It's also true, though, Stefan, to begin pessimistic, that even if you have relatively high IQ immigrants who are racially distinct, they do tend to feel alienated from predominantly white society. There are countries in the world, Canada being one and Australia being another, that do tend to have, they do try to discriminate in favor of higher skilled immigrants, which means that they tend to get higher IQ immigrants. But still, they have problems with deep alienation from the Indians and so on. And you know, if people find themselves in a society where they're in a minority, it's hard psychologically, and they tend to act out in various ways.
And they aggregate. And they congregate, because the whole idea of multiculturalism is, you know, instead of being these distinct mosaics, instead of being this balkanized societies where everyone from India clusters in one place, and even people from particular parts of India and particular classes of parts or castes within India cluster in one place, it was all supposed to, you know, well, we get it, this rainbow, we get it, this liquid, and we put it into this water, and we end up with better water or whatever it is. But that's not what happens. What happens is, yeah, go ahead.
This is where we've got to have a moratorium for 50 years, because, you know, if you look at what happened in the 20th century, they did have, in effect, a moratorium for 50 years. And, you know, the effect of this was that the groups that had come in did slowly begin to merge, to assimilate to the Anglo mainstream. The Anglo culture is extremely seductive, and people will assimilate to it if they possibly can. You know, Michael Novak in the 1970s wrote a book called The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics, and making the argument that the Eastern European ethnics who come into the country were quite different from WASPs and were not assimilating. But right at that time, in the 1970s, they started to assimilate. You started to see much more intermarriage and so on. But it did take 40 years. I mean, one of the interesting things about the two great waves of immigration to the U.S. is in some ways it's been a controlled experiment. When the first wave of immigrants came in, you know, so they were differentially, their skill levels were highly variegated. And what we found was, I mean, it's all there in the data. What we found is that skilled immigrants tended to have more skilled children, and lower skilled immigrants tend to have lower skilled children. And it took 4 generations for that effect to go away. But it was going away by the 1960s, at which point, of course, the U.S. stepped in and screwed the whole thing up again.
Well, that also could be explained by IQ and regression to the mean. But sorry, go ahead.
And you know, the thing is, these were not groups which were radically distinct. I mean, Southern Italians are not radically distinct from other whites. But now we have really dramatic differences. It couldn't be more dramatically different, the human groups that we're bringing in. As you say, sub-Saharan Africans, average IQ of 70. It's going to take 1,000 years for them to assimilate.
Well, and this question of allowing a pause in, you know, you can't eat continuously. Like your goldfish do it and they explode, right? I mean, you have to take a break between meals. And the idea that immigrants need to be, in a sense, digested into the mainstream culture. If you continue to have more immigrants, you know, you're thirsty, you're in the desert, you have a nice swig of water, that's wonderful. You get waterboarded, that's a whole different kind of experience.
And, you know, there have been many such pauses in American history. Most of them are not legislated. For example, one of the arguments you always get is immigration enthusiasts will say, well, Benjamin Franklin was worried about the Germans in Pennsylvania. Well, that worked out all right. Well, of course, what actually happened was German immigration simply stopped in the middle of the 18th century. And it didn't resume again for nearly 100 years until the 1840s. And that allowed the Germans who were in Pennsylvania to assimilate. And the same with the Irish, you know. If you look at the great wave of Irish immigrants came in, and it provoked a tremendous reaction in terms of nativism. There was actually a party, you know, the American Party, the Know Nothing Party, which destroyed the second party system because of the reaction to Irish immigration. But then Irish immigration stopped. The potato famine, was over, and the numbers of Irish coming to the country fell very dramatically. We're not aware of this because we're aware of the Irish influence on the American culture, but in fact, it was a trickle after the great waves of the 1840s and 1850s, and that also allowed assimilation to take place.
Right. And it's not that hard to figure this kind of stuff out. I mean, all you need to do, I would say, Peter, is perform the very simple mental experiment of saying, okay, if I moved to Zimbabwe, how long would it take before I felt perfectly naturally acclimatized and thought exactly like Zimbabwean people or close to it, you know, with a little spice and flavor in for difference? Or if I moved to Saudi Arabia, how long would it take for me or my children or my grandchildren to fully assimilate into Saudi Arabian culture? And if you think of that, it doesn't take more than a moment to say, that would be tough, that would be challenged. Now, if I move back to England, whole lot easier. Even if I move to Poland and learn Polish, a little bit easier, at least similar cultural histories and so on, religions that I grew up in and so on. But if you move to a place that's really foreign to your ethnicity, to your history, to your culture, to your religion, to everything about you, how long does it take to blend? Well, the answer is I doubt it would ever happen for you,
No.
maybe a couple of generations down the road. But if you continue to bring people in, you're not going to have any chance for the dominant culture to maintain itself. It's going to get washed away.
As you know, Stefan, in Japan, there is a Korean minority which has been there for many, many years, generations after generations, and they're still distinct, the Japanese. And most people can't tell Japanese from Koreans. The Japanese insist that they can, but they've never fully assimilated, although they're obviously very similar. But, the other question, Stefan, is why are we arguing about this anyway? Why do we have to have this immigration? What is the point of it? And the thing that struck me most as a financial journalist when I started to look into this issue in the early 90s was that there's a consensus among labor economists, that this great influx has not benefited the native-born Americans in any significant way. And this is a finding which is replicated right across the world. All first world countries the native-born are not benefiting in aggregate from this great influx. It does increase GDP, but the great bulk of that goes to the immigrants themselves. What it really does is it causes tremendous redistribution within the native-born community. In the US, when I last looked at the numbers, something like 2 to 3% of GDP is being transferred from labor to capital as a result of this immigrant influx, but through wage competition. And that, of course, explains the class nature of debate. If you're one of the owners of, it can be explained in very crude Marxist terms. If you're one of the owners of capital, you're going to benefit from this influx because you get cheaper labor. But if you happen to be a labor, if you're making a living in America by selling your labor, it's a disaster. And that's why we see stagnant wages for the last 30 or 40 years in the US.
Well, and this is the funny thing, too, because I wanted to touch on something you talked about back in 95, which was Mexico has written in its constitution, I've heard, that the demographics of Mexico cannot change. So you'd think that Mexico would all be about nationalism and so on, but Mexico's basically letting people go across the border. I mean, it's always like, well, we have to build the wall, they say in America, but of course, Mexico.
Okay, you can go check out the rest of that at Stefan Molyneux on YouTube. That one was titled The Ugly Truth About Immigration. Now to kind of talk about what they spoke about right there, about how immigration hasn't helped, it's actually made it worse. Part of that also goes to, again, the policies of the welfare state that immigrants are able to access, and the dumbing down of our own youth. I urge people to go to 1930s or even way before, and look at a lot of the curriculum that an elementary school kid had to learn. And then look at that where that falls into today's lessons. You're talking maybe middle school, more than likely high school. Things that elementary kids used to learn. And if you look at when this country was founded, yeah, we might have not had the technology we have today, but mathematics, engineering, all of this was still part of it. You still had to know mathematics. You had to have a decent education. Those who attended school that their parents didn't pull them out to work on the farm or whatever, the ones that their families allowed them to continue school, their curriculum, when they would get out of high school, I bet you that they had more basic knowledge than our college graduates today. They were learning that type of true chemistry, not just some, couple of worksheets and not really know, mix these two things I already prepared for you to mix into this and write about the reaction. Oh, it got hot and warm and fizzed over. Okay. So it has heating properties. Okay. What was that again? I don't know. These people back then would actually come out of school with a lot more knowledge than what we see in today's school. So part of that's also back to the immigration where, well, we had to dumb down schools because we brought in lower IQ immigration, where we were bringing people that didn't have that type of education. So we had to dumb it down a little bit. And we've been dumbing it down. And there's multiple things that cause that. Take the opportunity and don't forget to go UCY.tv and shop Amazon for UCY.
Keep it alive through these lines I write. I keep it live.